December 17, 1944. Hürtgen Forest, Germany. 0547 hours. The frost came first as a whisper, then as a bite. In the darkness before dawn, the forest floor of the Hürtgen held a silence so complete it seemed to have weight, pressing down on the frozen earth and the men who lay upon it. Corporal William E. Jones of the 2nd Infantry Division's 38th Regiment crouched in a depression barely deep enough to be called a foxhole, his breath forming small clouds that he consciously suppressed, making each exhalation last longer, spread thinner, become invisible. His M1903 Springfield rifle lay across his lap, the cold of the metal seeping through his gloves. In his right pocket, wrapped in a scrap of burlap, sat a single object that would become his signature, his calling card, his instrument of psychological warfare over the next 48 hours. A russet potato, ordinary and unremarkable, the kind that might have come from any farm in Pennsylvania or any field in Germany. He had taken it from an abandoned German supply depot 3 days prior. Now, in the pre-dawn cold with German positions less than 200 yards distant through the shattered pines, that potato would become something else entirely. It would become bait. It would become theater. It would become death. The Hürtgen Forest in December 1944 was not one battle, but a meat grinder that consumed American divisions wholesale. Stretching 50 square miles along the German-Belgian border, the forest was a primeval tangle of fir and pine growing so dense that sunlight barely reached the forest floor even at midday. The Germans had spent months fortifying it. Pillboxes concealed in the undergrowth, artillery pre-sighted on every trail and clearing, mines sown into the earth like seeds of iron. The American command wanted the forest taken because it protected the approaches to the Roer River dams, because it threatened the flank of any advance into Germany, because it existed and was held by the enemy. What followed was 3 months of close-quarters combat in conditions that belonged more to the trenches of 1917 than to the mobile warfare of 1944. Trees exploded into splinters under artillery fire. Men died without ever seeing their killers. The forest ate divisions, the 9th, the 4th, the 28th, chewing them up and spitting out casualty lists that read like massacre. By mid-December, when Jones arrived with the 2nd Division as part of the fresh units thrown into the maelstrom, the Hürtgen had already claimed over 24,000 American casualties. The Germans, fighting from prepared positions with intimate knowledge of the terrain, had lost fewer but fought with the desperation of men defending their homeland's threshold. Jones had been a hunter before he was a soldier. The mountains of western Pennsylvania had taught him patience, taught him to read landscape and shadow, taught him that successful hunting was 10% shooting and 90% understanding your quarry. He had been drafted in 1943, trained as a rifleman, discovered to possess an unusual talent for marksmanship, and eventually attached to his regiment as one of several designated marksmen. Not quite a sniper in the formal sense, with no special unit or dedicated spotter, but a man whose officers knew could be trusted with difficult shots and solo operations. In the Hürtgen, where front lines dissolved into a confusion of isolated positions, and where the Germans held high ground and knew every sight line, a skilled rifleman could achieve results all out of proportion to his rank. Jones had already been credited with 11 confirmed kills in his first week in the forest. But what he planned for the next 2 days would require more than marksmanship. It would require understanding something fundamental about soldiers and psychology, about routine and expectation, about the small moments of carelessness that get men killed. The Germans he faced were not the Wehrmacht of 1940, not the confident conquerors who had raced across France. These were men of the 275th and 344th Infantry Divisions, formations rebuilt after being destroyed in Normandy, filled out with teenagers and older reservists, led by officers who knew the war was lost but fought anyway, because retreat meant court-martial and surrender meant prison camp. They were cold, they were hungry, they were increasingly cynical about promises of wonder weapons and final victory. But they were also competent, disciplined, and defending ground they knew intimately. They had watched American units shatter themselves against German positions for weeks. They had learned that in the close confines of the forest, German machine guns and mortars could inflict casualties out of proportion to numbers. They expected the Americans to attack predictably, to bunch up, to expose themselves. What they did not expect was to be hunted individually, systematically, by a man who understood that soldiers in static positions fall into patterns, and patterns can be exploited. Jones had spent 2 days observing the German positions across the ravine from his company's line. He had noted the location of their machine gun nests, mapped the routes their runners used to carry messages between positions, identified the spots where soldiers emerged to relieve themselves or smoke. Most importantly, he had noticed something the Germans probably did not realize themselves. They had established a routine for checking their wire. Every morning, around the same time, a soldier would emerge from the main bunker and walk the perimeter of their position, checking the integrity of the barbed wire that protected their front. It was good practice, standard procedure, the kind of thing competent defenders did. It was also predictable, and predictability, Jones knew, was death. The potato had given him an idea that was part tactics, part psychology, part dark humor. If he could lure Germans into exposing themselves, not through their routine tasks but through curiosity, through the disruption of routine, he could shoot them before they understood what was happening. But the lure had to be specific, had to be something that would register as unusual but not dangerous, something that would provoke investigation rather than alarm. A potato thrown into German positions would seem random, puzzling, perhaps even absurd. A soldier who saw it would have questions. Where did it come from? Was it dropped by accident? Was it part of some supply? And in the darkness before dawn or the twilight after dusk, a man with questions sometimes steps into the open to find answers. At 0615 hours, with the sky just beginning to gray toward dawn, Jones took the potato from his pocket. He had wrapped it in the burlap, both to protect it and to give it weight. From his position, the nearest German bunker was roughly 180 yards distant, downslope, and partially obscured by the wreckage of trees. He could not see into the bunker itself, but he had mapped the approach, the small cleared area in front of the entrance where men would emerge. He pulled his arm back and threw the potato in a high arc. It sailed through the darkness, over the shattered stumps and frozen ground, and landed with a soft thump somewhere in the approaches to the German position. Then he settled behind his rifle, eyed the scope, and waited. 20 minutes passed. The cold worked its way through his layers of wool and canvas. His fingers began to ache despite the gloves. He did not move. In hunting, patience was not a virtue but a requirement. The deer that survives is the one that waits longest, watches closest, moves only when certain. At 0638 hours, a figure emerged from the German position, a soldier, young, carrying no weapon but wearing a helmet. He walked slowly, looking at the ground, clearly searching for something. He bent down, picked up the potato, turned it over in his hands with visible confusion. For a moment, he simply stood there, holding it, trying to understand this absurd intrusion into his morning routine. He looked back toward the bunker, perhaps considering whether to show this oddity to his comrades. That was when Jones squeezed the trigger. The M1903 Springfield was not the standard weapon of American infantrymen in 1944. Most carried the semi-automatic M1 Garand, but many marksmen preferred it for its accuracy and the familiarity of bolt-action shooting. The rifle kicked against Jones's shoulder, the report cracking through the dawn silence. At 180 yards, firing downhill at a stationary target, the shot was well within his capability. The German dropped without a sound, the potato falling from his hand and rolling a few feet before stopping against a tree root. Jones worked the bolt, chambering a fresh round, and waited again. This was the critical moment. How would the Germans respond? For several minutes, nothing. Then voices from the bunker, calling out. Another soldier emerged, crouching low, scanning the tree line but not yet understanding the danger. He moved quickly to his fallen comrade, grabbed him by the collar, began dragging him back toward the bunker. Jones aimed, compensated for the movement, fired again. The second German fell across the first. Now the Germans understood. Machine gun fire raked the American positions, wild and unaimed, a response to threat whose location they could not precisely identify. Jones pressed himself into his shallow depression and let the bullets chew the earth and trees above him. The firing lasted 30 seconds, then stopped. Silence returned, deeper now, edged with new wariness. Jones did not move from his position all day. His company commander, Captain Miller, found him at midday and asked for a report. Jones explained what he had done, what he planned to continue doing. Miller was skeptical but did not order him to stop. In the Hürtgen, Any tactic that killed Germans without costing American lives was worth attempting. Miller arranged for another rifleman to bring Jones water and rations to cover his position if he needed to relieve himself. Otherwise, Jones was to be left alone to work. As evening approached and the winter darkness came early at 1630 hours, Jones took out the potato again. It was the same one. He had crawled forward during a period of German artillery fire, using the noise and confusion as cover, and retrieved it from where it had fallen beside the first dead German. Now it carried traces of frozen blood, though in the darkness this would not be visible. He threw it again, this time in a slightly different direction, toward a different section of the German line. Then he waited with his rifle and his patience. The psychology of the potato was deliberate. It was absurd enough to be memorable, mundane enough not to seem immediately threatening, mysterious enough to provoke curiosity. When the second potato appeared in their positions, the Germans would have questions compounded by the morning's deaths. Was this connected? Was it some kind of American signal or marker? Was it bait? The clever ones would suspect a trap. But in military units, not everyone is clever, and even clever men sometimes make mistakes when cold and tired and trying to maintain watch in darkness. At 1702 hours, a flashlight clicked on in the German positions. Someone was searching for the potato. Jones aimed at the light and fired. The flashlight fell, still burning, illuminating the undergrowth and the body that now lay beside it. Another voice called out in German, sharp and alarmed. A figure ran from the bunker to the fallen man. Jones fired again. The figure stumbled, fell, tried to crawl. Jones fired a third time. The crawling stopped. This pattern, the potato, the weight, the shot, repeated itself over the next 48 hours with variations improvised based on German reactions. Jones threw the potato at different times, in different directions, sometimes leaving it, sometimes retrieving it after a kill. He varied his shooting position, moving along his company's line to different vantage points so the Germans could not pinpoint his location. He learned their schedule, their shift changes, the moments when new soldiers took over positions and might not yet have been briefed about the potato. He learned to shoot in twilight, at dawn, in the gray overcast afternoons when snow flurries reduced visibility to hundreds of yards. Most importantly, he learned that each death created its own opportunities. The Germans could not leave their dead lying in the open. Morale and military protocol demanded retrieval. But every attempt to retrieve a body exposed more men to his fire. The potato became a marker of death, a calling card that announced his presence and his patience. The Germans, for their part, adapted as best they could. They stopped emerging during predictable times. They attempted to retrieve their dead under cover of artillery fire or smoke. They sent out patrols to find and kill the American marksmen. But Jones was never where they expected. He moved constantly, never fired more than 3 shots from any position, used the forest's density and the confusion of the front lines to disappear. The potato, meanwhile, took on a psychological weight beyond its material reality. German soldiers began to fear it, to see it as an omen. This was precisely what Jones intended. In static warfare, morale matters as much as ammunition. A soldier who fears stepping outside his bunker, who hesitates before routine tasks, who sees death in ordinary objects, is already partially defeated. By the evening of December 18th, Jones had been credited with 17 kills. By midday December 19th, the count had reached 31. These were confirmed kills, bodies seen to fall, positions observed to go silent. The actual number might have been higher, accounting for men wounded and dragged away or killed in positions not visible from Jones's vantage points. His company commander, initially skeptical, now regarded him with mixture of admiration and unease. This kind of hunting, this methodical elimination of individual targets, required a coldness that made even other soldiers uncomfortable. Jones did not boast about his kills, did not carve notches in his rifle stock, did not display the dark humor common among infantrymen. He worked with the emotional detachment of a craftsman, each shot a problem solved, each death a task completed. The culmination came on the morning of December 19th, at 0520 hours, in the last darkness before dawn. Jones had positioned himself in a shell crater on the extreme left of his company's line, a spot that offered a flanking view of the main German bunker. He had saved the potato through all the previous engagements, and now he prepared to throw it one final time. But instead of throwing it toward the German positions, he threw it short, into the no-man's land between the lines, where it would be visible in the gathering light, but would require someone to leave cover completely to retrieve it. Then he settled behind his rifle and entered the state of focused calm that hunters know, where time seems to slow and the world contracts to the view through the scope. At 0605 hours, movement. Not one German, but three, emerging together from the bunker in a coordinated rush, clearly planning to retrieve the potato and return before any American marksman could react. It was a sound tactical decision, a response that showed they had learned from previous losses. But 3 targets meant 3 opportunities, and Jones had prepared for exactly this possibility. He had pre-aimed at 3 points along the route the Germans would have to take, had already worked the bolt between imaginary shots in his mind, had calculated the timing. The first German fell at 70 yards. Jones worked the bolt, swung to the second target, fired before the man could process what had happened. The third German, to his credit, did not freeze or run back. He dove forward, seeking cover in a shell crater. But Jones had mapped that crater, knew its depth and angles. He aimed at the spot where a man in that crater would have to raise his head to see out. 30 seconds later, when the German's helmet appeared above the crater's rim, Jones fired his third shot. The helmet dropped. Behind him, American soldiers who had been watching began to whisper, then to cheer quietly. What Jones had just done, 3 aimed shots, 3 targets, all within perhaps 12 seconds, was marksmanship of exceptional skill under combat conditions. But Jones felt no satisfaction, no triumph. He felt only the cold and the exhaustion and the knowledge that his position was now compromised. German artillery would plaster this section of line within minutes. He gathered his rifle and what remained of his equipment and crawled back toward the company's main position, sliding into a communication trench just as the first shells began to fall. The artillery barrage lasted 20 minutes and achieved nothing except to churn frozen earth and shatter more trees. When it lifted, Jones was a quarter-mile away, drinking coffee from a canteen and cleaning his rifle. The company clerk found him at 0900 hours with orders to report to battalion headquarters. He walked back through the forest, past aid stations where wounded men lay in rows, past supply dumps and mortar positions, and all the infrastructure of industrial warfare. At headquarters, a colonel he did not know wanted to hear the story firsthand, wanted details about technique and tactics. Jones answered the questions with the same emotional flatness he brought to everything, describing shots and distances and timing as if discussing crop rotation. When the colonel asked how many kills he had achieved, Jones said he was not certain, perhaps 40, perhaps more. The colonel checked with the intelligence officer who had been compiling reports. The number, based on confirmed observations and German radio traffic intercepted and decoded, was 43 enemy casualties directly attributable to Jones's actions over 48 hours. It was, the colonel said, among the highest short-term totals for any individual American marksman in the European theater. Jones was recommended for the Silver Star. He received it 3 weeks later at a ceremony held in a commandeered brewery 10 miles behind the lines, along with a promotion to sergeant and a reassignment away from the Hürtgen to a training unit where his skills could be passed to other designated marksmen. He served out the war teaching others to shoot, to be patient, to understand that combat marksmanship was less about the rifle than about the mind behind it. He returned to Pennsylvania in late 1945, worked in a hardware store, married, raised children, and rarely spoke about the war. The potato story emerged only decades later, when a military historian researching small unit actions in the Hürtgen found references in after-action reports and tracked Jones down for an interview. By then, Jones was in his 60s, and the war seemed like something that had happened to someone else. The 43 Germans who died in those 48 hours have no collective memorial, no marker to note their passing. Most were buried in temporary graves that were later consolidated into the German military cemetery at Hürtgen, where 2,400 German soldiers rest in the forest they tried to defend. Their names, or known, are inscribed on simple stone markers. Many have no names, identified only as ein deutscher Soldat, a German soldier. They were sons and brothers, conscripts and volunteers, Men who wrote letters home and worried about the future and tried to survive the winter in a forest that had become an abattoir. They died for causes lost before they fell, defending territory that would be taken anyway, killed by a man who felt nothing personal toward them but understood that war reduced human beings to targets and targets to numbers. The potato itself, the object that became symbol and instrument, was lost somewhere in the Hürtgen during the final artillery barrage. Perhaps it lies there still, rotted and returned to earth, indistinguishable from the soil. Or perhaps some soldier, German or American, found it in the aftermath and ate it, never knowing the story it carried. An ordinary object that became extraordinary not through any quality of its own, but through the use to which it was put, the meaning it was given, the deaths it marked. It represented nothing about American abundance or democracy. It was not a Hershey bar or a Zippo lighter or any of the manufactured goods that German soldiers marveled at when captured. It was humble, agricultural, something that grew in both American and German soil. But in Jones's hands, it became a tool as effective as any weapon, proof that psychology could multiply the effect of marksmanship, that warfare was not just about firepower, but about understanding the enemy's mind. The story of the potato ruse circulated through the division, then the regiment, then into the broader folklore of the Hürtgen fighting. It was told and retold, embellished and streamlined, until it became almost mythic. The tale of the sniper who used a potato to kill dozens of Germans, turning something absurd into something lethal. The specifics changed with each telling. Some versions had Jones using multiple potatoes, or calling out to Germans in their own language, or marking each kill with a notch carved into the potato itself. But the core remained consistent. One man, one rifle, one ordinary object transformed by context into something else. It became a story about American ingenuity, about the individual initiative that the American military culture encouraged in ways the more rigid German system did not. A German soldier faced the potato and saw a puzzle that required investigation. An American soldier, Jones, looked at a potato and saw a tool, saw possibility, saw a way to turn the enemy's discipline and curiosity against them. But beneath the folklore lies a darker truth about what men become in war. Jones was neither hero nor villain, but something more ambiguous, a skilled craftsman of death who performed his task with precision and emotional detachment. He killed 43 men in 48 hours, not in the heat of assault or the chaos of defense, but methodically, patiently, with calculation. He turned combat into a craft, killing into a technical problem. There was no mercy in this, no quarter given, no distinction made between the dangerous and the merely dutiful. The German checking his wire, the soldier searching for a potato, the man trying to retrieve a fallen comrade. All became targets, all died with the same bullet's efficiency. This is what war does. It takes men who might be farmers or merchants or teachers and turns them into instruments calibrated for killing. It takes ordinary objects, a potato, and transforms them into harbingers of death. It creates situations where shooting a man for showing curiosity becomes tactical success worthy of decoration and promotion. The Germans who fought in the Hürtgen expected many things. They expected artillery and infantry assault, expected armor if the Americans could get it through the forest roads, expected air attack if the weather cleared. They expected to fight and perhaps to die, but they expected it to follow certain forms, certain recognizable patterns of combat. What they did not expect was to be hunted as individuals, to have their routines studied and exploited, to die because they picked up a potato. War had always contained elements of the personal, the sniper's bullet, the knife in darkness, the intimate violence of close combat. But the Hürtgen fighting and actions like Jones's represented something different. The systematic application of individual lethality, a kind of warfare that was neither heroic charge nor defensive stand, but something closer to extermination. The Americans called it aggressive defense. The Germans called it murder. Both were correct. When the Hürtgen Forest was finally taken in mid-December 1944, after 3 months of fighting that accomplished little of strategic value, the American units that had fought there were hollowed shells. The 2nd Infantry Division alone suffered over 5,000 casualties. The forest itself was a ruin. Trees shattered, earth churned, the ground sown with unexploded ordnance that would kill civilians and foresters for decades after the war ended. For what? The Ruhr dams, the original objective, were not captured until February 1945, and by then the Germans had flooded the valley anyway, delaying the American advance by weeks. The Hürtgen became a symbol of the war's late-stage futility, of battles fought because plans had been made, of men fed into the meat grinder because no one in command would admit the objective was not worth the cost. Yet within that futility, individual acts retained their own logic, their own terrible efficiency. Jones's 43 kills did not change the outcome of the Hürtgen battle or shorten the war by a single day. But they meant that 43 German soldiers did not fire their weapons at advancing Americans, did not man their machine guns, did not resist. In the mathematics of attrition that governed late war fighting, this was success. Each German killed was one fewer obstacle to overcome, one less rifle or Panzerfaust that might kill an American. This is the calculus that allows soldiers to sleep after killing, that turns moral questions into tactical ones. The enemy is not a person but a problem, and death is not tragedy but solution. The potato, that humble tuber that sustained both armies, became in Jones's hands a perfect symbol for what the war had become by late 1944. Ordinary things turned to instruments of destruction, routine transformed into deadly trap, the familiar made fatal. It was not the abundance that American soldiers represented to their enemies, not the chocolate bars and cigarettes and canned goods that German prisoners marveled at. It was simpler than that, more elemental. It was food, it was sustenance, it was the earth's gift that both sides understood and valued. And Jones turned it into death. There is genius in that, terrible and undeniable. And there is something darker, something about what happens when the distinction between tool and target, between human and objective, dissolves entirely. In the end, Jones returned home and became a clerk in a hardware store, selling nails and hammers and paint to customers who never knew what he had done in a frozen forest on the other side of the world. The Germans he killed remained in that forest, their bodies moved to organized cemeteries, but their deaths rooted in that soil. The potato rotted and returned to earth, feeding nothing, marking nothing, remembered only in stories that sound like myth. The Hürtgen itself grew back, slowly, the trees reclaiming ground scarred by shell and mine, covering the traces of the battle that consumed so many for so little. But the lesson remains, carved not in stone but in the record of what men will do when nations set them against each other with rifles and orders. The lesson is this, that war transforms everything it touches, makes weapons of food and tactics of psychology, turns patience into lethality and curiosity into death. That ordinary men, given training and cause and enemy, will become extraordinary in their capacity for organized killing. That the line between civilization and savagery is thinner than we believe, maintained not by any inherent human goodness, but by circumstances that can change in a moment. Jones was not a monster. He was a soldier who understood his task and performed it with skill. The Germans he killed were not villains. They were soldiers who died doing their duty, defending positions they were ordered to hold. Between them was the potato, absurd and mundane, transformed by context into something else entirely. A marker of death, a tool of war, a symbol of how everything, even the most ordinary objects, becomes currency in the economy of violence that is combat. The potato lies in the earth still, or what remains of it, indistinguishable from soil. The men it killed lie in earth too, their names carved or forgotten, their deaths recorded in after-action reports filed in archives. Jones died in 1994, an old man in Pennsylvania, his war 49 years behind him. And the Hürtgen Forest grows, green and silent, concealing under new growth the iron and bone that will rest there until the earth reclaims them entirely. The story survives because it captures something essential about war, not glory or heroism, not the mythic narratives we prefer, but the cold mechanics of killing, the way men learn to turn anything at hand into instruments of death, the way war makes sense of the senseless until nothing seems extraordinary anymore, not even 43 men dead because they could not resist investigating a potato lying in the snow.